the Tin Men performing a tribute to Fats Domino at d.b.a music venue in New Orleans on Wednesday night. Annie Flanagan for the New York Times. New Orleans. People woke up here on Wednesday to discover that Fats Domino, one of the last links to the moment when New Orleans R&B morphed into early rock and roll, was gone. From Mr. Domino's Ninth Ward home to Uptown, from the French Quarter to Metairie, musicians across the city pondered a future without Fats, while music fans reacted in the only appropriate way to mark a death in New Orleans by having a party. Brian McIntosh opened the Kerry Irish pub in the French Quarter around midday. The doors were thrown wide to the street and whole lotta loving was turned up loud, as Mr. McIntosh readied himself for the day. The music's rowling, and I'm sure he'll be having a few shots of Jameson in honor of Fats later, Mr. McIntosh said. The Fat Man changed my life, he mused. Back in the 90s, I was in Dallas with my girlfriend, Jamie. We were in a nice little breakfast diner with an old-style jukebox, trying to cure out hangovers with breakfast. I heard Fats Domino's Walking to New Orleans on the jukebox. Jamie looks at me and says I've been thinking of moving to New Orleans. 3 months later we were down here and I've been here ever since. Ricky Gittridge left, and Luckman Asadola outside Mr. Domino's old home in the Ninth Ward. Emily Kask, Agence France-Presse, Getty Images. Mr. Domino was a product of the lower Ninth Ward, and his home, built in 1960, was a shrine to his success as an early rock-roll star. When Hurricane Katrina flooded his neighborhood to the rooftops in 2005, Mr. Domino was thought to have died. But days later, New Orleanians found out that he had been rescued. The refurbished Domino home on Caffin Avenue at Mare Street, a vivid yellow structure with musical notations and dominoes as visual motifs, is still a must-see for tourists. And on Wednesday afternoon, musicians and fans gathered outside it, leaving flowers and playing his songs. But on Frenchman Street in the Marigny neighborhood, the music hadn't started yet. The tuba player Matt Perrine was getting ready to offer his own tribute to Mr. Domino with Alex McMurray and the Tin Men at d.b.a, a live music venue. It's odd to say this, but I feel like I did when Prince died, Mr. Perrine said. When somebody who I respect that much dies, I try to figure out how big a hole is left, he said. This one looks like a chasm. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like to recover from his loss. I had to break the news to my dad, said Don B. Bartholomew, a son of Mr. Domino's frequent collaborator, the band leader Dave Bartholomew. He took it terribly hard. I called him about 1 o'clock today. I knew he would be getting calls and I didn't want him to hear it from the public. But it was so difficult to tell him. Mr. Bartholomew now runs the studio in the city's 7th Ward where his father and Mr. Domino used to write and rehearse. On Wednesday afternoon, he was working out arrangements for his family to participate in memorial events. Down the block, some of his neighbors were out on the porch playing Mr. Domino songs and drinking beer. Inside the studio's office, where the sleeves of Mr. Domino's rock and roll records from the 1950s were on display, Mr. Bartholomew remembered the man he thought of like Uncle. Fats was in this studio and it was just a rehearsal space. They would be in here jamming, writing songs, rehearsing for tours, Mr. Bartholomew said. I remember going to the airport to meet him. It was very impressive. All the gold rings, high fives, head slips and bills to us kids. We'd go to his house in the Ninth Ward, and he was always in his room cooking some food. To me, he was the world's greatest piano player. I think of him as the real king of rock and roll. Over at the Circle Bar overlooking Lee Circle, where a controversial statue of Robert E. Lee was removed earlier this year, the roots rock band The Iguanas were preparing for their early evening performance, working out which of Mr. Domino's songs to include. Every time I sing one of his songs, especially lately, I think about how he might not be around for much longer, said Drew Cabral, a band member. Now that he's gone, the songs take on a different meaning. Street performers in the French Quarter. Annie Flanagan for the New York Times. Meanwhile, the Creole String Beans were rehearsing at Funky Nola Studios for a Friday night gig and preparing some of Mr. Domino's material. I'm trying to stay happy in spite of the news, said Derek Houston, a saxophonist. I saw Fats dozens of times. I would go to Jazz Fest to see him and put my kids on my shoulders in the interests of raising them right. See that man up there? He was born in New Orleans just like you were. The greatest things in life need to be celebrated. Out in the New Orleans suburb of Metairie, Mr. Domino's old friend, the drummer and vocalist Bobby Cure, was preparing a tribute to Mr. Domino at the Max. "Every other song will be Fats Domino tonight," he promised. "We always play Fats. Blueberry Hill always gets the biggest response. Everybody sings the first line, and they all get up and dance." Mr. Cure promoted Mr. Domino's performances in neighboring Chalmette during the 1980s, and his band often opened for Mr. Domino's. "We played together at the closing of Pontchartrain Beach," he said, referring to a local amusement park that was shuttered in 1983. "We've been friends ever since," he added. "It was sad to see him lose his memory recently." Jimmy Mesa, a regular performer on Bourbon Street at the Tropical Isle, said he was stunned by the news of Mr. Domino's death. "I lived in Chalmette all my life and work in the French Quarter," he said. "I'd pass by Fats' house in the 9th Ward every day." Mr. Mesa said that one day a taxi driver told him, "I know Mr. Fats. He calls me and gives me his grocery list, and when I bring him his groceries he gives me a $50 tip." Back at the Circle Bar, Mr. Cabral looked out the door as night fell over the city and pondered the obelisk where Lee's statue used to be. "I would like to see a statue of Fats Domino atop it one day," he said. "Who wouldn't?"